My name is Farley. I am from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. And here with me tonight is Matt Duss, who is a research associate at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and a blogger at Think Progress and Wonk Room. How are you doing tonight, Matt?
I'm doing well. How are you, Rob?
Doing just fine, just fine. Tonight we are here to talk about President Obama's speech. This is, to the extent it makes any sense, it's blogging heads action. Talking about something that happened very recently. And of course, we needed more pundits to immediately talk about the speech right after, and especially more white dude pundits. And
exactly, because
we're here to address that shortage.
The 50 people on CNN's set were clearly not enough.
Right, exactly. This is where you go for the actual punditry rather than all those networks with all those guys and ties and so forth. So, what did you think about the speech?
As I won't say I was really surprised. I thought it was a good speech. I think he said what he needed to say. And, frankly, even though, I won't pretend I'm not nervous about the undertaking, I thought he gave a pretty stirring defense of American leadership and America's role in the world, as I think he has done repeatedly in the past. He did again tonight. Right.
I mean, I watched it, and I have to confess that I am still in a stage of being unconvinced about anything about this particular Afghan escalation or surge or whatever you want to call it. And I came away from this still unconvinced. I thought that he gave just about the best possible defense of this particular escalation. But I came out of it still not 100% sure that I wanted to come on to, for example, blogging heads and forthrightly defend the president's plan for escalating in Afghanistan. Certainly, I suppose it's odd that I don't necessarily agree with the critics of the speech either on the right or the left, but at the same time, I can't find myself in resolute agreement with the policy that the president set forward, which is essentially the same policy, or very similar to the same policy that General McChrystal called for earlier this year. That I guess I'm still not 100% convinced that the goals that we've established for ourselves in Afghanistan are achievable. And it was nice. I thought it was very nice that the president reminded us. One of the strongest parts of the speech was when the president reminded us why we were here in the first place, and gave a little bit of history. And the history was, I think, quite critical of not necessarily calling out the former President Bush by name, but it was quite critical of the way in which Afghanistan has been handled thus far. Clearly laying blame for the mishandling, and for my money, accurately laying the blame for the mishandling of the war in the previous administration. And I found that part of the speech very compelling, and that sort of filled me with enthusiasm to the extent that, we really did mess this up, and, given that we messed it up, maybe if we have smarter people and we approach it more intelligently, we can really make it right.
How could that possibly go wrong?
Right.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I mean, as far as going into the history of this, I mean, I think it was important in the way, I don't know if I'll quite say that he took ownership, because ownership of 9/11 has never been the exclusive province of the right, but you have to, I think we would agree that President Bush and, people around him, conservatives, really, milked 9/11 for a lot. Such that I think a lot of liberals and progressives got defensive about, talking about 9/11 in the context of national security to justify some of these decisions. And I think he used it in a very appropriate way and say, listen, we went there because this, people attacked us who planned this and plotted this and came out of this area, and that's why we're there.
Right. And in that sense, I mean, I think that parts of the speech were defensive, but in a domestic political context, that part was not defensive at all, right? I mean, he clearly took the bulls by the horn in terms of the domestic debate over national security, over toughness in national security. It's just that I wasn't necessarily convinced by the policy prescription.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think Fred Kaplan had a pretty good piece in Slate yesterday or the day before, basically just saying, I'm ambivalent, which, I think is a place that a lot of people are, including myself. I think I would probably come down on the president's side here, but by a nose, I think, Paul Pillar, I've written about this before on the Wonk Room. He has, he's stated in a number of different venues, I think, one of the most, concise and really troubling, cases against the war, just saying, listen, even if this entire plan, Paul Pillar, just for the viewers, he's a former intelligence official, very well respected, saying, listen, even if this all goes well, even if this whole counterinsurgency plan works, if we do everything we're aiming to, the overall effect on America's nationalist security could very well be negligible.
Right.
And that's pretty troubling.
Right.
So, there was no answer to that really tonight. There was really no answer to that tonight. But I don't know if we were really expecting one. All of that to say, we're going forward here, still pretty ambivalent, but as Kaplan said, the president does not have that luxury.
Right. Some of the issue comes down to what is the difference for Americans between an Afghanistan that is in chaos, in civil war between the Taliban and other elements in Afghanistan, the Karzai government and even other elements, and an Afghanistan that is in slightly less turmoil, but that is more or less controlled by a more or less friendly government in Kabul. And the answer most commonly given that this would preclude safe havens in Afghanistan if we have the slightly more friendly government in charge has never sounded all that terribly compelling to me. In part because you don't really need, having training bases and so forth is important, but you don't need a huge infrastructure in order to run a terrorist organization. So in other words, there's this nebulous they out there that will still be able to hit us even if we do have a friendly government in Afghanistan. And this nebulous they actually doesn't even live in Afghanistan right now. It lives in Pakistan.
And increasingly in Yemen and Somalia.
And increasingly in Yemen and Somalia, where the United States is also sort of mucked around a bit. Let me, and this is from a progressive viewpoint, and so let me run this by you and see what you think of this. And we've had this conversation before, or elements of this conversation before. When McChrystal puts forth this plan, and when Obama adopts his plan, where there's 30,000 troops are supposed to go in and 30,000 additional troops are supposed to go in and win the war. When the Coindeistas said that about Iraq in 2007, I didn't believe them. In fact, I vociferously didn't believe them. In fact, I think I went so far as to say that people who think that this will work are idiots and understand nothing about military doctrine, strategy, and so forth. And whatever the strategic failures of the surge in Iraq, and I think it hasn't solved the essential strategic problems of the Iraq War. Tactically and operationally, it seems to have gone quite well. And so, in that context, it makes me really nervous about saying that this won't work, right? About implying that this won't work. Because, Iraq is different and everything, but this kind of move really did kind of reduce violence in the short and the medium term in Iraq.
Right. I think, granted, I've written my own mea culpa too. I was highly skeptical of the ability of an increase in troops, or of any action in the context of a foreign military occupation to really lower violence significantly. And I was wrong about that, and happily so. I think there are other people discussing this. You and I have discussed this. There were any number of factors that contributed to and worked along with the surge. And what it left us with, I think, is still an open question. Iraq is still an incredibly violent place. Right. But yes, it did succeed in bringing down violence. Now, as to the longer term effects of the strategies that were employed there, building up these local tribal leaders, these power centers separate from the government, these deals that were struck with the U.S. forces and not with the central government, I think, we're still seeing some serious issues there. The inability of the Iraqi political system to really deal with some central political conflicts. But, yes, it's no longer a haven for al-Qaeda, which, of course, it wasn't before we invaded But no, that's a significant success of the counterinsurgency strategy there, and I think we recognize that. Now, as for Afghanistan, first of all, I think we should recognize, and Spencer Ackerman wrote about this today, is that, conservatives particularly keep calling this a surge because they want to brand this along with the Iraq surge.
Right.
But it's really not a surge. It is a sustained escalation.
Right.
These troops are going, they're going to be reinforced after their tours are over. It's not just going to end after their tours are over. We're going to keep sending troops there.
Right.
And I think, that should be noted. So, and as, it also, it's also worth noting, obvious point, but important, Afghanistan's a different country. People talk about tribal strategies, and the tribal structure in Afghanistan is much different from Iraq. It's much less hierarchical and much more fluid. So the kind of deals that were struck in Afghanistan, it's not clear that we could do the same thing. But I think the leadership understands that. Petraeus has said this. McChrystal has said this. I think this is understood at that level.
Right. And Afghanistan is also, it's a much different society than Iraq. The level of infrastructure, the level of human infrastructure in terms of literacy and so forth is much lower. In Afghanistan, it's a much poorer society than Iraq. To the extent where you would be skeptical that you could achieve even the same degree of centralized control in Afghanistan that you even have in Iraq right now. And this is even understanding all the problems that Iraq has with centralized control. There seem to be even more in Afghanistan. Which is, again, a troubling aspect of this. Now, you mentioned that this isn't a surge in the sense that it will be a sustained buildup. But what did you make of the president's argument? And I can't remember his exact wording, but it was start withdrawing in 2011 or turning over the war in 18 months. Do you recollect what exactly the president said about a drawdown?
I think there was a bit of a controversy today because CNN reported that it was going to be a withdrawal, but I think after that, I think it was made clear that by 2011, we will definitely be starting to hand over significant authority to the Afghans, is what the goal was.
Right.
So it's not that we're going to start drawing down in 2011. It's by 2011, we'll definitely be, letting them take the lead as was done in Iraq last year.
Right.
So, and again, on the question of timelines, and this is where, we're seeing, McCain, of course, is coming out against timelines. He's always been against timelines. This is where we're going to see, I think, conservative attacks. Where are they going to attack Obama now that he's done pretty much what they wanted him to do? Well, they're going to attack him on the timeline. They know that we're going to leave. Well, guess what? They always knew we were going to leave, and it's important for them to know that we're going to leave. I think it bears repeating that this eliciting open-ended commitments from the United States is in fact one of Al-Qaeda's larger goals.
Right.
And this is something that conservatives never really seem to grasp. You had the statement from bin Laden, I think it was 2004, where he was just mocking the United States, and he said something along the lines of, all we have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the farthest corners of the earth and have them raise a piece of cloth upon which is written Al-Qaeda, and their generals will come running.
Right.
So this idea that Al Qaeda was going to provoke the United States into these long-term commitments and just bleed us. Let's look at this crisis we're in now. It's not like we have all this money to spare. You can see that this is kind of a strategy they're working on, and I can't say it's completely failing.
Right, and it's fascinating that strategy almost always seems to work. Right. One of the reasons, and I want to talk a little bit more about the president's mentioning of Vietnam, because I thought it was very curious and very interesting. But one of the reasons we were supposed to be staying in Vietnam was to essentially indicate to the Soviets we couldn't be pushed around. Mm-hmm. But of course, the Soviets were delighted by the amount of money and lives we wasted in Vietnam. They couldn't have been happier that we continued our commitment there. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we had no interest in the end in seeing the Soviets leave Afghanistan.
Right.
We were
more than pleased for them to show us their resolve in Afghanistan. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. It was wonderful for them to attempt this, and I think you could say the same thing about Israel in Lebanon as wars against Hezbollah. That these efforts to demonstrate resolve seem very often to be traps, simply traps to collect blood and treasure from an enemy. And it's sort of shocking that our strategic class still doesn't, really wrap its mind around that. So,
right.
So on this Vietnam thing, why do you think that the president mentioned Vietnam? Because usually presidents are pretty reluctant to talk about, especially presidents ordering significant escalations in counterinsurgency conflicts, are reluctant to talk about Vietnam. So what's your thought on the Vietnam angle?
Well, I think it's a generational thing. Obama is someone who, he's not of that generation. I think he has a different experience of it. I think Vietnam, even for our generation, continues to overhang our political culture. I don't think that, that will take a long time to change, but for people of President Obama's age and our age, it's just different. It's something that we've grappled with in a very different way. So I think he just felt freer to mention it and dismiss it as a comparison.
Right. So our connection with Vietnam is, in a sense, more intellectual and less emotional.
Yes, I think that's right.
Say John Kerry's generation or President Bush's generation. And so it has a certain different political meaning for us.
Yeah. I would agree with.
Well, but did you buy the president's argument on how Vietnam is in fact different than Afghanistan, and so therefore shouldn't be thought of as a meaningful, useful parallel?
I wouldn't say I completely bought it. Obviously Vietnam is different. We're dealing with a very different enemy. I think at last check, I think Al Qaeda is estimated about 200 guys. Right. But we're dealing with a very different world at the same time. 200 guys with access to, even a few guys with access to internet and access to information about weapons, working secretly in open societies can do a hell of a lot of damage, and they're certainly endeavoring to do that. So I did and I didn't agree with it, but I mostly did. Right.
The parallel was obviously supposed to go beyond, although it would have been wonderfully hilarious if the president had said, you see, Vietnam is all have jungles and Afghanistan hardly has any trees. So that would have been hilarious.
That's also true.
Not really in a funny way, but obviously, I think that what he was trying to talk about was the way in which the American decision apparatus sort of thought through the escalation in both cases. And what he wants to do is make the argument that no, I'm not thinking this through in the same way that LBJ did.
Yeah, right.
In spite of what would seem to be some clear and obvious parallels.
Right. This goes back to one of his most notable statements during the primary, saying he doesn't want to just end the Iraq War. He wants to end the mindset that got us into that war in the first place.
Right.
As he said in his original 2002 speech against the Iraq invasion, he's not against all wars. He's against stupid wars.
Right.
He obviously feels that Afghanistan is not a stupid war. Now, I think we can have debates and discussion over whether and how he's succeeding in changing the mindset that got us into the Iraq War. Personally, I think I would like to see him do better on that score. But, working against a very entrenched and frankly very militaristic conception of America's international interests, I think, it's a significant undertaking. So, give him time.
Right. One thing that I did like, and there's been a little bit of discussion about this and the conversation lately has been about the proposed Obey Amendment, where there would be a war tax.
Right.
But it seems like, especially in the past few weeks, there's been more explicit conversation about how money spent on wars is actually made of real money.
Yes.
Rather than sort of the more traditional conception in which money spent on wars isn't actually money, in the sense that
right.
you can just make it up out of nowhere, and it doesn't take away from any other part of the economy.
Right, and we never question it because it's just it's whatever they need, they got to get.
Right. And I think Senator Bai said, "Well, national security always comes first." It's like, okay, that's great, but it does cost something, Evan. You know that, right? You seem to care about spending on everything else, including healthcare.
Right.
And I think the president did make clear that he understood that, and I think he tried to make people understand that, this is really something that we spend money on, and it's not good for our economy and for the world's economy. to be spending outlandish sums on waging wars in distant places.
Right.
That by and large this is a bad idea and ought to be avoided.
No. Right. No, I think this is a really productive discussion that's going on right now. Even if the the war surtax really has very little chance of going through, I think this discussion we're having, in which we're really starting, I mean, especially at this moment where you've got conservatives going all out against healthcare, we can't afford it, all big government. It's like, well, these huge military expenditures are also a form of big unaccountable government. It's long overdue, and I think we can look at the defense budget that President Obama and Secretary Gates came out with a few months ago, where this idea that, this is real money, and when we spend money on some things, that means we don't have money for other things. A very basic kind of understanding, but one that, strangely enough, has rarely been applied to our defense spending, and they brought that to bear on, the defense budget. So I think this is all good.
Right. It's sort of fascinating, because, I guess I grew up sort of during the period, and in the 1980s, it was legitimate to ask questions about why we were spending so much money on the military, and then all those people who asked those questions got voted out of office. But it was sort of fascinating to watch, as I grew up, people unlearning the idea that defense spending was actually money, because I think you could almost, at times, you could palpably see it happen. People, just the understanding that this was some other part of the budget, that this money was some other color or something, and that it was something entirely different. And it would be nice to bring back that skepticism about military spending, which is actually has traditionally been a hallmark of American political culture for a very long time. And we're sort of in an odd situation in terms of American political tradition right now. So, any other points about the speech itself that you wanted to talk about?
Not really. Should we move on to former VP Cheney's press release in Politico today? Right.
Perhaps you would briefly summarize that for.
This, was a real treasure. The Politico ran I guess we'll call it an interview with former Vice President Dick Cheney, who's obviously been very forward and visible in kind of unprecedented way for a former vice president, criticizing the new administration on national security specifically. But he gave this interview today, just going all guns. And one particularly entertaining passage was where he was asked whether he thought that the Bush administration, in which he served, bore any responsibility for muffing up Afghanistan, and he said, no, I just disagree, and did not elaborate, and apparently was not asked to elaborate by the reporter.
Right, and I believe the story itself, actually, you said the vice president did not elaborate, right? I mean,
yes.
Those were the exact words used in the story.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, it was. He did not elaborate. It's like, well, ask him to elaborate on that, because that's a pretty important question.
Right, because it's as if someone just showed up and said that the sun went out last week.
Exactly. And opinions differ, so.
Right, the world is flat, but he did not care to elaborate on his position.
No,
No, there's a craziness to it, right? There's just an absurdity, because and you would think that, I mean, I guess I see it as cynicism, right? I mean, I doubt very much that many of the usual suspects at the Weekly Standard and so forth actually believe that the Bush administration is not responsible for mucking up Afghanistan. But of course, it's the party line, right? It has to be the party line at this point, right? Yeah. This is the way the Democrats are attacked on national. Maybe I'm just giving too much credit. I guess ideological self-deception runs really deep, and so maybe I shouldn't expect that they actually are lying, right? Maybe they think that they're telling the truth. But it's insane, right? I mean, the contention would seem to be that something so bad has happened in the past 9 months that it requires a tripling of our commitment to Afghanistan, but that was completely unforeseeable and totally unrelated to the Bush administration's conduct of the war.
Right.
It beggars belief. It's way out there, man. I mean, it's just
going back to we had this new Senate report confirming what we already knew, that the Bush administration made a choice to not to get bin Laden when it seems very clear that they had an opportunity to get him.
Right.
I was under the impression that getting bin Laden was a priority of the Afghanistan mission, but apparently appears not. And then, of course, the decision to invade Iraq, which meant not only getting troops ready and refocusing resources, but refocusing administration attention, pulling key foreign policy hands, off of Afghanistan onto Iraq, not delivering promised aid. I mean, there was this big, and frankly, I remember it at the time. I forget what the exact date of the speech was, but President Bush gave, a pretty impressive speech, essentially outlining a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, which never materialized. So yeah, it's abundantly clear that the President Obama has to clean up President Bush's mess here, and it seems just beyond ridiculous that you'd have people like Cheney and Rove and these clowns out there, attacking Obama for the way he's sweeping up their mess.
Right. And it's fascinating. I mean, the space that Dick Cheney occupies in the national consciousness now is fascinating because he's almost in the way that in Nixon's later years, Nixon was able to reforge himself as an elder statesman who was essentially above criticism. Because the reason Nixon was above criticism is because everybody already knew he was evil, and so what was the point of actually criticizing him? And Cheney is almost occupying the same space, right? Everyone hates him. His approval ratings are, as far as I can tell, negative, and so there's no point in anyone actually challenging what he says. And so, oddly enough, his reputation for evil means that he can get away with anything. I find that fascinating. But I'm all behind the Cheney Pale in 2012.
Yeah, I don't know. Those crazy things have a way of happening. So I remember, 1999 being like, George W. Bush, give me a break. And anyway. But I think Cheney, he in a way he really has to come out and do what he's doing. Just because it's just so patently obvious that policy failed, or even if you want to call it a policy, as far as I could tell, there really wasn't any policy for most of the time. But he is someone, and we can, I don't really want to get into whether he was a true neoconservative. It doesn't really matter. I mean, neoconservatives have grouped around him and found in him a standard bearer for their vision of a very, muscular, militaristic, interventionist foreign policy. And over the course of the Bush administration, that whole ideology and worldview was pretty conclusively discredited. So he really doesn't have the option of debating the facts. He's just got to be out there making assertions, and depending on cooperative journalists to let him make those assertions. Right.
It was discredited even within the Bush administration. By the second half of the Bush administration, those people had lost a tremendous amount of traction within even intra-administration debates. And it's fascinating. It's just fascinating that it's coming back out again.
Right. I mean, even as we debate, how to deal with Iran and, criticizing trying to engage Iran, well, even in the surge in Iraq, a part of that success of that strategy was reaching out and talking to people who had been killing us 2 weeks ago. And it's just amazing to me how this just really hasn't been absorbed. There's still this idea that we just don't talk to enemies, and it's pointless. And the kind of larger lessons of counterinsurgency, even though Cheney and those around him have been more than willing to claim the success of the surge as some kind of vindication of the invasion of Iraq, which I think it's clearly not. They just refuse to apply those lessons, the lessons of counterinsurgency, the idea that we want to disaggregate our enemies, the idea that we want to reach out and identify and identify reconcilables and not group all of our enemies into one big monolith. They just don't really seem to get this.
Right. And sort of on this point, I think that sometimes, or on this last point about a counterinsurgency strategy, sometimes we maybe forget just how different the Army and the Marine Corps are now than they were 7 years ago. We're really talking about entirely different instruments of national policy than the ones that existed just a few years ago, and we've really had, really to my mind, one of the most fascinating transformations of United States military structure and organization that has almost ever been seen, especially in a major power. And it's fascinating how these debates have happened, how these debates are happening in the context of the drive for a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. And it's also interesting to think about it in terms of, well, what if this doesn't work, right? What if it doesn't even work on the same level that the surge in Iraq worked? And so let's say that the Taliban continues to drive strength, that the extra troops actually produce more resistance, or other balancing behavior from other actors. What does that do sort of to the greater security conversation and even to what's happening in the military? Does it kill COIN? Is COIN still vulnerable to being killed by failure?
That's a great question. No, I don't think it's capable of being killed. I think it's capable of being placed in a much smaller box, as a lot of people in the military would clearly like to do. But no, I would agree with you that the transformation of the military is pretty significant. And I think, you and I have had conversations, and there's been other conversations about to what extent progressives should embrace the counterinsurgency as a doctrine. And I think you and I are pretty much in agreement that counterinsurgency is neither conservative nor progressive. It is a military doctrine. It has aspects to it that I think one could identify as progressive, but that doesn't make it progressive. Right. But I would just, going back to what I said, about the kind of global applications of the kind of counterinsurgency concept, the idea that we talk to enemies and we don't aggregate our enemies, we seek to disaggregate them. I think just this basic understanding, that there are root causes to terrorism and insurgency, and we need to diminish to the extent possible those root causes. I think that in itself is kind of, it's a line of thinking that is much more closely associated with liberalism and progressivism.
Right.
And I think that's pretty significant. I always think of this great line from Bob Dole during the 96 presidential election where he said, "It's time to start going after the root causes of crime, criminals."
Right.
And, that's kind of the conservative position on terrorism. We need to go after the root causes of terrorism, terrorists.
Right.
And, counterinsurgency is saying, well, that's not really right. Sure, you need to go after terrorists where you find them, but you really need to be, you understand that there are environments that create terrorism and insurgency, and let's do our best not to create those sort of environments.
Right. So, I'm one of the stupidest debates that pundits ever actually have is debates about horse race politics, right? So, questions was, well, did the president convince the people he needed to convince with this speech? As if pundits on CNN could ever actually answer that question. But you know what? This isn't CNN. This is Blogging Heads, and so I'm convinced that we are capable of answering that question. So, did the president convince the people he needed to convince? And when I'm talking about the people he needed to convince, do you think that this speech was convincing, or even could be convincing, to the president's progressive supporters, many of whom, obviously have a great deal of skepticism about, military action more generally and escalation in particular in Afghanistan?
Well, it obviously depends who we're talking about. I would say, and of course I'd probably be proved wrong tomorrow morning, I would say he did convince, he convinced enough people, I will say, to give him time. I think there are certainly going to be people, like Dennis Kucinich and others who are just completely, in favor of withdrawal now.
Right.
But no, I think he probably did what he needed to do, which was say, all right, listen, I've got this new strategy. We understand it's a mess. We understand it's a very difficult undertaking, but, we need to take an opportunity and give it some time to see if we can move things in a positive direction. So right. I think he did that.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the speech was, on the whole, there were certainly parts of the speech that were geared towards conservatives, but at the same time, I think the president now finally understands that conservatives will never be on board, even if he does exactly what conservatives want.
Right.
And so, I guess maybe one of the things that was fascinating is that, and I'm not sure I've ever seen this from an actual president in my lifetime, that this was a president having a conversation about national security geared towards a specifically liberal audience. And I think that's why he took time to come back and remind why we're in Afghanistan. I think that's why he took time to talk about the failures of the Bush administration. Because, I mean, it's particularly, those are the kind of tropes that this audience will respond to. And so I guess, I would think probably that he has, as you suggest, bought himself a little bit of time on this. But it's unclear how much time there'll be, and it's unclear how long progressives will be bought off. I mean, I don't think there'll be anything like a primary challenge in 2012, but certainly progressive enthusiasm could wane because of the escalation in Afghanistan.
Definitely. I mean, I think he did a good job. I think, and I'm curious what you think about this that line where he said, at no point was there a plan in front of me that would have put American troops in Afghanistan before 2010, which I think does a good job knocking down the dithering argument, saying, listen, there was never, I made the decision now. Had I made the decision 3 months ago, troops still would have been in theater in 2010. Right. And I think as we saw a few weeks ago, the Karzai government finally, after a lot of cajoling and arm twisting, announced the creation of this new anti-corruption unit, corruption being a major problem in Afghanistan. And an effective and credible governing partner being a key element of an effective counterinsurgency strategy. I think that kind of showed that the Obama team had successfully used some leverage and used this whole examination process to kind of put a little bit of fear in the Karzai government. So, I mean, I think that needs to be recognized as an effective use of leverage. So, another thing that, kind of knocks down the dithering argument. He wasn't just sitting around staring into space. He was actually creating and using leverage with this government. Right.
The entire dithering narrative was fascinating because it was most often brought up by people who, I mean, you never, for example, the last 5 years, no one who thought the United States should withdraw blamed the president for dithering, right? Only people who demanded escalation blamed the president for dithering, yet they were attempting explicitly to blame the president for dithering, not for the decision itself. When, in fact, we know if the president decided forthrightly 6 months ago that there was going to be no escalation, then they would have been much less happy.
Right.
And then you get really bizarre columns like David Broder's of a couple weeks ago, which specifically called out the president for dithering, as if process was everything and outcome was nothing. So it's always been one of the most fascinatingly absurd parts of the discussion. It was interesting, though. I agree. It was interesting that the president shot it down. And I mean, he shot it down briefly, but he shot it down very effectively. The dithering, such that it is, has had no cost thus far. So, why we wouldn't take as long as we wanted to actually think about fighting a war is a really good question.
Right. Yeah, I think that is, that's one of the things I think he kind of underlined well. He's like, listen, this is a serious undertaking. And, just my view personally is, anyone who thinks there's very little to think about here is not thinking hard enough. They have not, they don't take this whole idea of war seriously enough.
Right.
And I think that's really a point that progressives cannot make against conservatives enough.
Right. Yeah, I concur. Well, is there anything else that leaps to mind, or shall we turn it over for the evening?
No. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, it's been good to talk to you with you, Matt, and we hope that everyone has enjoyed our on the spot take on the president's speech.
All right. Thanks a lot.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.